Welcome to the No Shame Podcast. This is John Groders. Today's guest is Tim Mahoney, one of my favorite people and one of the most important and influential documentary filmmakers in the world today, in my opinion. His latest film is so important, so needed. Stick around and find out about the Moses controversy today on No Shame.
Have no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame.
Well, I am here at the No Shame Podcast this morning with Tim Mahoney, a longtime friend of mine, and the producer of a brand new film that has just been released through the Fathom Network. And why don't you tell me about it?
Yeah, it's called Patterns of Evidence, the Moses Controversy. And some of you say, well, I didn't know there's a controversy about Moses.
What's the controversy?
Yeah, there is a controversy. Actually, there's multiple controversies, but the one that we started focusing on was the fact that a lot of, let's say, mainstream scholars, in other words, they're not necessarily Bible believers, but they're critical of the Bible. They're critical of, did Moses write these first books? And this has been going on for a long time. For the last 150 years, there's been people have been criticizing the writing of the Bible because they don't think that it's historical. So that is the controversy that we start with. But this film then, as all good films do, starts in one direction, and the adventure then just grows and becomes a much bigger investigation.
I'm so excited to see this film, and I haven't seen it yet, but I did, like many of us, see your previous work, which was Patterns of Evidence Exodus. And if you haven't seen Patterns of Evidence Exodus and you're listening to my podcast and you're interested in the Bible, I highly recommend it, because the Bible's a lot more fun if it's true and if it's accurate. And I have spent the last 25 years of my life, like you, walking through the lands of the Bible, seeing archaeological evidences, meeting with people. And, you know, I'm not proclaiming to be any great scholar. I don't want to elevate my intellect, but everything I have seen in 25 years continues to validate that the Bible is incredibly accurate. And I think your work has been a key contributor to that recognition with what you did on the Exodus.
Well, that first film, I know that took about 12 years. Well, you think, well, how could it take 12 years? But when you're on a journey like this, you start in certain directions. And I didn't know so much that was there. I mean, I didn't understand all the concepts, and it took a while for me just to find evidence. And now I'll just share with you that the first film investigates the question of the Exodus, because the Exodus is a foundational story in the Bible. And we ended up asking the question, can we find evidence for the Israelites in Egypt, like Joseph? Is there evidence for Joseph and their arrival, their multiplication, and their enslavement? And this film started to uncover evidence for that, but not where everyone was saying it would be. That's why the technique of a patterns of evidence approach is so powerful, because you're looking for a pattern and you're looking for it in the right sequence, John. That's what's important. And so you realize that oftentimes people have a theory. Let's say a theory comes up 50 years ago, and some scholar said he finds one idea and he says, "This is it. I found the one idea." But it's like a puzzle piece. Nothing else fits to it. And that's the reason why a patterns of evidence approach is so important. And we were able to find 6 sequential patterns in that first film for the Exodus and the conquest.
So I'm speaking with Tim Mahoney, and we're on the floor of the NRB 75th Anniversary Convention, and it's quiet right now because this floor doesn't open for another 15 minutes, so we actually have a few minutes of quiet in here. But you are a classical documentary filmmaker now. That is the essence of what you're doing.
Right.
And a classical documentary filmmaker goes out and listens to all sides of a story. Is that how you approach it?
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, I didn't know that in the beginning that was so important. But it is fundamentally important, I believe. Most documentaries today are more one point of view. And so they're sort of telling a narrative about, they're documenting something. But when you move into more multi-viewpoint documentaries, And I think that that's when you allow the audience to be free to make a decision about something. And the type of documentaries that I'm producing, the approach is to get the criticism so that I understand. Explain to me why you have a problem with Moses writing the first books of the Bible. Help me understand what your premise is. Explain to me, how you arrived at that,
right,
and what's the basis for that. And then once you understand that, then you can realize that, well, maybe there's just an interpretation. But and generally speaking, in all these films, you start to understand that often it's like the Wizard of Oz. The facade is so powerful, you don't realize that there's this little premise that's in the corner making all this activity happen, and everyone's intimidated by the Wizard of Oz, and then there's really not a lot behind it.
Well, we think the wizard knows more than we do, so we don't dare question. I mean, for myself, I was a college student. It's been a while now, but when I went to a Christian college and was taught through my religion department that pretty much none of the authorship of the Bible was actually what it proclaims itself to be, my professors said it was the J and the Y and these different theories. And then they went to the New Testament and they told me those weren't written by and I was a 19-year-old kid without a shred of intellect or evidence to, like you say, question the wizard. These were college professors. They certainly knew a lot more than I did. Now that for the past several decades, I've had a chance to even learn more like you have, and if I could take those classes again today, I would raise my hand and I would ask some poignant questions.
Yeah.
So you've been spending the last 15 years of your life basically 3,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you don't live in the modern, 2019. You live in about, 1500 BC or so?
Well, yeah, part of the, I call it weaving, part of the weave is that, with a storyline, you can either have the main plot line, then you have maybe a subplot and different things that are going on. In my particular filming, I see them as a weave. So I'm trying to take the thread of my own life and the thread of what's happening culturally right now. But I start with the Bible, then we say, well, what do people think about it? And then I'll get the con, and then I'll get the pro, and then I'll get interpretation, and then I'll take my own life and weave it in there. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to keep it contemporary. So why does it mean? And we started this question with the Moses controversy.
Right.
Right now, almost all of the big major issues in our culture stem from the Moses controversy. The words of Moses are telling us from this divine inspiration that God created the world, and that he created male and female, and that there is a fall of mankind and sin entered the world. So these fundamental ideas come from the authorship of the first 5 books of the Bible, and it lays the foundation for Judeo-Christian thinking and actually for a lot of Western civilization, which is at a clash right now with many of the ideas that are in the culture.
So, multiple choice question. The first 5 books of the Bible, we call them the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books of the Bible. The last film, again, Patterns of Evidence, Exodus, I highly, highly recommend you get a hold of this and watch it if you're interested at all in the veracity of your Bible. Because like you said, the Exodus, if it didn't happen, then why did we celebrate the Passover, for 4,000 years? Why did we teach our children that if the Exodus didn't happen, then I think like Paul, he says if Jesus wasn't resurrected, then we were fools amongst men. I would dare say if the Exodus didn't happen, then our Judeo heritage would be foolish because we commemorate it all the time. It was the event where God called a people, brought them to Sinai and created the first ecclesia, which means called out gathering. The first church was the church at Sinai. Those were God's, it actually calls them in the Bible, firstborn son. Even. You can win a trivia. Who's God's firstborn son? You say Jesus. It was the people at Sinai. So if it didn't happen, then you know what? We probably don't have much to validate these texts. But you found some amazing things that validated the biblical story in your previous documentary.
Right.
For example.
Well, for example, is there any evidence that Joseph existed or that he came? And what they found is a lot of people have, the Bible says that the Israelites lived in the land of Ramesses. Ramesses was a name of a pharaoh, and the land of Ramesses was the land that he was in control of. Well, this underneath this city. When scholars looked at the time of Ramesses for the Israelites, they didn't find him.
Right.
They
It's
couldn't
about
find
1200, right?
Yeah, 1250, 1200. Yeah, that's exactly that
BC,
time period,
right.
BC. So, but if you dig underneath the city of Ramesses, just off to the side a little bit, there's an older city that's like 600 years older. And that city is called Avaris.
Avaris.
And Avaris is where they see a group of people that were Semitic, and the Israelites were Semites, right? So they're Semitic people, and they were allowed to come in a small group, and they grow into this larger group of people. But in the center of that community is a palace, and there is this palace. Who owned it? Well, they learned that this palace was owned by a Semitic person because of the graves, and it had an area where there's tombs and a pyramid tomb. And there was a statue in that tomb, and it was of a person who was light-colored skin with red hair. Mm-hmm. Now, you just think, well, red hair, why does that matter? Well, Jacob's family,
Esau.
yeah, Esau, Edom, it was reddish. He was
Right,
a reddish
right.
complexion.
That's
so
awesome.
the family had sort of this reddish complexion to it. So what do we find is that Joseph probably has that same sort of gene of being a redheaded,
Yeah.
possible, because it connects. It's not an Egyptian. And not only that, but then around those, that pyramid tomb, which they've never found another pyramid tomb with a Semitic person in it. And the Bible says that Joseph was second in command. So there's a huge connection. A number of Bible scholars see this as the Israelites and Joseph being in that land. But the rest of the graves, there were 11, not 9 or 7 or 6 or 14. There were 11 other principal tombs. And what does it say? That Joseph had, these brothers, 11 brothers, the 12 tribes of Israel. And so this is how there's a connection there. And then eventually these people, live and prosper, and then they become into hardship. And we see slavery, and we even see evidence of graves. When they leave, we see the plague pits. And then there's Egyptian documents that basically say things like, during this time of judgment, that's the fourth step in our film, it says that the river turned to blood, slaves have become rich. And, people are dying. I mean, it matches almost all of the plagues of Egypt. But, John, the reason why no one connects it is because it's earlier in time. The pattern isn't where they thought it was. It's earlier in history.
Well, if you're listening to, I'm with Tim Mahoney, the author of Patterns of Evidence, Exodus, and what you have just said, if you're listening to this podcast, this is what I would call smoking gun evidence. This is finding the weapon in the hand of the perpetrator. The bullet has just been fired and the gun is still smoking. This is how significant that film is because, again, it matters whether the Bible is reliable. It matters if the Exodus happened. There's going to be a lot of books you can find and a lot of professors you can go listen to that are going to disagree with our conversation right now. But what you have found boldly has refuted, I think, 100 years of skepticism. I'm that excited about it. I believe the Exodus did happen. I don't believe that the Egyptian pharaohs were going to carve a lot of carvings on their own sarcophaguses, depicting that event because they weren't happy about it.
Right. In fact, the piece of literature that you get is poetry. It's a warning not to let this happen a second time. That's the Ippur papyrus, the admonitions of it, I think, of Ippur. But I'm going to share something with you. So the second film, I was going to work on the route of the Exodus, and the new film, The Moses Controversy, I had no idea. This is, even a year ago, I had no idea that we were going to be searching for, I thought if it's an eyewitness account, if the Bible is an eyewitness account, then what should we be looking for? We need to see if Moses had the ability to write something that could be written down. And they said that Hebrew didn't exist at the time of the Exodus. It happened later. But what we ended up finding out is in Egypt, somebody took hieroglyphs and modified them into the world's first alphabet. And this film uncovers that alphabet, one of the professors, an Egyptologist, says, he goes, I think it comes from Avaris. And so what we think possibly happened is that Joseph and his family created the world's first alphabet. And the premise of this film starts to show the connection that this alphabet, there needed to be some writing for the Bible in this time that the Israelites lived there, in the region they lived. It had to be alphabetic because all Torah scrolls were alphabetic. And it had to be in a form of writing like a Semitic. And that's exactly what was found. And why is that important? It's important because oftentimes scholars will say, well, this is just a myth, like we have many myths, that over time the stories of the Bible were exaggerated around the campfire, and the story kept getting bigger and bigger. It wasn't just that we walked from Egypt to Israel or something, but we passed through a sea, and the drama of the whole story. And the children are going, tell us the story about the parting of the water.
Right.
That's not what the Bible says. The Bible says these things happen. That God acted in history. And so what we find, what this next film does is it uncovers the fact that, and this is the most powerful thing after I made the film, was that I started to realize that here we have an alphabet at the exact time when Moses could have used it to write the Bible.
Right.
So the big question is it just a coincidence?
Right.
Or was it necessary to retain the knowledge of God?
Now let me throw a little curveball here. Just if you're listening to this podcast and you're not a Bible scholar, you might get a little bit lost. I'll just try to give you the big picture a little bit. Jacob, right? Jacob has a wife named Rachel, and he has a couple other wives. There's 4 altogether. But Jacob has 12 sons.
Right.
So Jacob, the final 2 sons of Jacob and Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. Rachel dies during childbirth of Benjamin. Another topic that I want to talk to you about and introduce you to a former guest I've had on this podcast, Dr. Steve Smith, who I've just finished a book with. He's going to show you an inscription from 400 years earlier with Hebraic writing on the wall of a cave where the name Rachel has been inscribed, where he believes she was buried. I'm just throwing that as a possibility because now we're going to move forward 400 years before we get to Moses. So you have to know there's a time gap here between when Joseph comes down to Israel and is in the Pharaoh's court, and then his brothers come down because of the famine, and that was your last book, Patterns of Evidence, Exodus. Did that story happen? But it's 400 years after Joseph. They've been in slavery for 400 years that God then, through Moses, who he calls to lead them. Maybe you remember the story of the burning bush. Moses was a reluctant leader. He had been in Pharaoh's camp. He had gotten in a fight with a soldier. He'd been expelled because he was going to get executed himself, and he's called back to lead his people out. This is the Moses who now we have said God is the one who personally shows Moses the 10 Commandments, the law. And you remember the story where he brings them down from Sinai, and anyway, this the whole thing. That, I just want to give us a point. This is where Moses comes into play, 400 years after the Exodus. Now... No,
not after the Exodus, but...
I mean, after Joseph, sorry, right. Yeah. Moses leaves the Exodus after Joseph.
Well, actually, let me help you with the numbers a little bit.
Help me with everything.
Okay, yeah. So the promise was given to Abraham.
Now even earlier.
Yeah. So, and this is another area that we'll get into probably just to clarify. But this promise was given that God gave a promise to Abraham. And Abraham is, some people would say, the father of, 3 world religions. The Islam sees Ishmael as, the descendant from there, and Isaac for the Israelites and the Christians.
Right.
Well, there's a promise that Abraham would have a son, and this promise then, but then it was said that the Lord told Abraham that his descendants would wander, and then they were given this land, but they wouldn't receive it for a long time. They would be enslaved in a foreign nation, but in the future they would return to the promised land. And you've worked in the promised land an awful lot with your films that you've made earlier. So the question then is we'll talk a little bit about it maybe at another time, but because I'm not up on all the details and the dates, but it's from that promise to the Exodus, or to the time in the promised land, and there's the wandering in the wilderness. So the question is when did that happen, and so it's 400 years from that period to this period. So I know it's hard visually, not to, you and I are visual people.
Yeah, give us a timeline so we can see this. Yes.
Yeah, and so some people would say that the Israelites were enslaved for 400 years, and others would say, well, that from Abraham's life through Isaac's life, through Jacob's life, through the time that they were in Egypt to the death of Joseph, and then a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, who did not remember Joseph. So that could have been like 215 years from that promise, and then another 215 years.
Okay.
And why those questions are important is because it depends on where you start looking for the evidence. And so I hold to, and I think a number of other earlier scholars, it wasn't until just recently, in the last 100 years or so, that people started thinking that they were enslaved for 400 years, and then it got popularized. But I think that their slavery was a shorter period of time, because it says the sojourn and then the enslavement, and then it kind of just got down to the enslavement for 400 years. Your wilderness. So they left off the understanding of wandering, and in other words, they weren't. They didn't possess the land during the time of Abraham or Jacob's or Isaac's life or Jacob's life, and those were included in those years.
Well, they certainly didn't possess the land, because after they come out of the Exodus, there's going to have to be some warring going on, and the Bible gets pretty bloody for a few years in there, and the Jebusites and Hittites. And
now, I'm going to give you one other mind-blowing kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So we think that the Exodus happened a long time ago, right?
Right.
So if let's just say we say that by the time you're 35, you're going to have a family,
Right.
and then. And that's what's happened to my own family. I've got 4 grown kids, and all of them in their 30s have had children now.
Right.
So, how many generations back to the Exodus, if you take 35?
I bet fewer than I'm going to guess.
Yeah, I'll give. Do you want me to give you the number? So
Yeah.
100.
I was going to say 100. I really was.
Were you?
I actually was.
Okay, we should have
wish
wrote that down on a piece of paper.
Erase the tape and back it up. I want to sound right. It's only 100 generations.
3,500.
There's 100 people standing around this room right now.
Exactly right. We can see them.
Yep.
So I mean, when you think about the fact that, that's all the further it be back, we're only 10 generations back from 350 years. So I mean, you think about that. That's like 1650, I think.
Wow.
And so what ends up happening is that we think this is a long time. Now, there's another verse that's interesting, that God loves us. I can't remember exactly the phrasing, but to 1,000 generations.
Yeah.
Now, so we're only 100 generations back, and the reason I bring this up is because I've met some Jewish rabbis that can tell you they can name all. They've taught it to their children. They know all of the ancestors, all the way back to Aaron.
Wow.
And so you think from a DNA, and by the way, there's DNA, that there was a testing that was done. I interviewed this Professor Skorecki, and he submitted it to a scientific magazine where they had these different people saying that they were they were Kohanim, they were priestly Israelites. Mm-hmm. But some of them were from around the world. And it's like, well, how can this person, who looks very different than this person? That's some people from Africa who said they were Kohanim. So they did a DNA test. And guess what?
Yeah,
they were all related.
They were. Wow.
They were all a part of that priestly, genetic connection.
So let's talk about Moses again. So if we had to establish that there could have been an alphabetic language that he would have known, because if he was writing, he was writing in a language, Hebrew. Yeah. And I think you can easily establish, not easily, but you can establish that he knew how to write Hebrew. Why does the Bible claim that Moses writes the Torah?
Oh yeah. By the way, Jesus talks about this in John chapter 5. Jesus says, because you not believe in the writings of Moses, how you believe my words, And so what ends up happening is that Jesus is testifying that Moses existed, and that he wrote about him. And that's why you have to understand, some people that are younger today maybe suggest that, well, I don't read the Old Testament very much. I'm just sort of into the New Testament. I don't get all that stuff.
Right.
But all of the things that Jesus and the disciples are referring to are the scriptures in the Old Testament, because that's all they had. And they didn't say, hey, turn to Matthew 5 or something, because Matthew hadn't written it yet.
Right. The Bible Jesus knew.
Right. And so Jesus is referring to the prophets and to Moses. Moses was the first major prophet, And so what ends up happening is that I understand it this way, and Jesus is saying this: if you don't believe in Moses, then you won't believe in me. And guess what? That's exactly what's happening, John. People who don't believe, in this new film, which we uncover this connection to the first writing and to the Israelites and to the alphabet and to revelation of who God is. The professors who don't believe in Moses eventually don't believe in Jesus, because the whole thing is built upon credibility of the foundation.
There's someone right down the hall that would agree with you. There's a ministry that you may have heard of called Answers in Genesis, founded by the Australian Ken Ham. And Answers in Genesis has a magnificent website and magazine. And they would affirm what you're saying, that if we cannot stand on the book of Genesis, that the whole rest of the Bible kind of falls apart.
Yeah.
And they've taken it from some different, they've explored that question from some different perspectives in some ways than what you did, but you're coming to the same conclusion, that when you open the first page of the Bible, you're on pretty solid ground.
Yeah. Well, it helps us to understand where we came from, who we are, what's right and wrong, what are we supposed to do, how are we supposed to live, and so much of what we are, how we've lived right now, we're experiencing in America, for example, the fruit of a biblical worldview. But if people don't understand that the fruit of it is tremendous, and the idea of having freedom, which all these nations want, the idea of building upon trust, of law and order, when law is injustice, we see all sorts of movies. A major theme in a lot of movies is injustice, right? And so, thankfully, there earlier people in our nation did take the Bible seriously, and they saw a connection between the Exodus. In fact, the founding fathers even were potentially going to use the cross at Moses and the Israelites. Sort of written was Pharaoh, and the colonialists were the Israelites, and they were wanting to break the bonds of that oppression. And the Liberty Bell, has a verse from Deuteronomy on it, that if each man could rest in the shade of their own tree, free from the oppression. I think that's the gist of it. So there's all these connections to the Bible in our nation, and the idea of civil rights. Martin Luther King, what does he do? He goes back to the Bible. The premise that we have rights and that each person has value is based upon not evolution, but based upon a biblical understanding. Otherwise, if it's evolution, then it's survival of the fittest. Who cares about?
There is no morality under evolution. It's just survival of the fittest.
It's whoever can make whoever is strongest wins.
Right. So I would like you to help anyone who's listening to our podcast. You might have the opinion that, like with technology, that if it's more recent, it's superior to what came former, because we have faster microprocessors today than they did 25 years ago. We have the assumption that modern scholarship is always better than ancient scholarship. So you probably are fighting against maybe an unspoken paradigm that says, well, maybe they used to believe that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and maybe George Washington and John Adams might have believed that. But for Pete's sakes, we live now in the 21st century, and frankly, we know better. How do you respond to that?
Well, what's happened is that the Germans, for example, who started criticizing the Bible, were Germans. They were from a completely different culture, and now what we learned is that as the understanding about how the Bible was written started to become more clear, and the cultural ways that it was laid out. Let's say with there's always these so and so begat so and so. That's sort of the chronology of the family. that was part of the Bible. Is a legal document in the first books. It's a document that basically is making a covenant, and covenant is an agreement. In fact, covenant later becomes federal, and we have a covenantal. It's an agreement between man and God. So it's a legal binding document with a narrative inside it. And this poetry of the ancient world, the Germans didn't know that much about it. So when they started questioning the authorship of the Bible, and they saw different names for God, they didn't really know why. They thought, well, this is a different writer, and this is a different writer, and it became madness later on. So we're going to continue to unfold that and show I think show a completely different way to see this with modern scholarship. And by the way, what I've heard is a lot of people don't believe in this documentary hypothesis anymore. A lot of the contemporary scholars that are on the cutting edge. But guess what? They still teach it. They teach it as doctrine because I won't say what the motives is, but they're not necessarily open. And I have an interview with the Professor Peter Gentry, who is at the University of Toronto, and he said they were talking about the documentary hypothesis. And this documentary hypothesis for the audience is that 4 or 5 different authors over the course of centuries wrote the Bible. Now, by the way, there's never been a book that's been written like that, ever. They can't identify one. So it's just kind of mad theory. How in the world would we get a book from 400 years ago and I decide to take it on and continue to fill in the blanks and write and take a verse here and a verse there and change things up? It just has never happened. Mm-hmm. So the point is that this new scholarship is showing that this didn't happen, and it's that there are themes and structures within the Bible that are so interwoven that it came from one author, and then there's prophecies in it as well. And all of this points to Mosaic authorship. And yet, I was telling the story about Peter Gentry, and he was in his class, and they were teaching this over and over and over. And finally, one day, he had read a book by Umberto Cassuto, a Jewish man, who is basically looking at all the problems with this theory. And so Peter raised his hands and said, excuse me, what about this book by Umberto Cassuto, which is challenging the documentary hypothesis? And the professor said, well, we don't read those kinds of books here.
There's your modern scholarship.
Yeah.
I'm talking with Tim Mahoney, and he's the producer and the director of Patterns of Evidence, Moses. And again, I apologize to anyone listening because I haven't seen it, or I would be really talking specifics about this film. I'm dying to see it.
I'll get you a link.
You're going to get me a link. But all of you out there listening to the podcast, you can go to the website and you can order the DVD. And if I can get Tim to put Cineview on his website, you can download it from his own website. And you'll start a relationship with Tim. I appreciate the thinking updates that I get, the Thinking Man updates that I get. They're short and they're brief and they're on point and they're helpful because you're doing, in my opinion, you're doing such important work. I really praise God for you, Tim, because if you weren't doing this, nobody would be doing this. There's not a long line of booths here at this wonderful National Religious Broadcasters Convention of people who are willing to take the long 12-year process, all the air flights to Israel, the time to sit down with people you disagree with, the hours that you must spend just poring over these issues. But you're doing it. I mean, you're listening on this podcast to Tim Mahoney. He is the one in the world who is doing this right now. And it matters because if you want to trust what the Bible has to say about our future, you've got to be willing to trust what it says about our past.
Oh, it's really powerful, yeah.
I really think that Answers in Genesis has done my life a tremendous service. The work you're doing is doing all of our lives a tremendous service because you're giving us solid ground to stand on that goes, when you open the first page of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, these are, if you haven't read these books in a while, okay, Leviticus can get a little bit tough at places. There's about 17,000 pages of how to build the tabernacle, but the details, the specifics, it doesn't read like a fairy tale. You wouldn't put, 23 chapters of how to build the tabernacle. God was very specific. And if you haven't read Genesis for a while, it is as good as Homer's Iliad, but better. That's kind of a stupid way to put it. But it's magnificent. It's where we come from. It's the answers to our deepest questions.
Well, the other thing that people don't realize is that, we're reading a translation, but the beauty of which it was structured and Hebrew, and there are so many more connections to information that is so powerful. I mean, I'm just the. I'm going to tell you like a pomegranate.
Yeah.
Now, there's a number of seeds in a pomegranate, and I don't know what that number is. It's like 100 and some, or it could be several hundred. I don't remember the exact number, but the thematic themes within the Bible and how you were talking about the tabernacle. This is where Moses was instructed to build this place, a dwelling place for God, when they were in the desert, and they created this tabernacle. Well, just the connection between this pomegranate. I was at an archaeological site, and they found this pomegranate, which would have been on the hem of one of the priests. It was a small, something that would be like a bell that would ring, and that's what they were supposed to have. So what's important about that is that the seeds in that were the exact number of the laws or commands that they were supposed to.
Really?
So yeah, there's these
never heard that
connections.
before.
Yeah, there's these connections.
And pomegranates were carved in the temple later when
Right.
Solomon builds the temple.
Right.
That's one.
Right.
They didn't make graven images, but they were okay with fruit and vines and grapes and pomegranates.
Yep.
It was an important symbol. They didn't pick their symbols lightly.
Yes, and there's also things that deal with numbers, like the Hebrew. Hebrew is the letters are also numbers. I don't know if you knew that. And there are so many interconnections that when you look at these interconnections, they are startling. And so anyway, I think that when people are trying to understand their place in the world, and you've got people that are thinking through their faith. I mean, the name of our company, we have two companies. One is Mahoney Media Group, which has made commercials just like you have done and did a lot of project work. The new company that I've had in the last number of years is Thinking Man Films. And I think that I'm just a regular guy, but I'm just trying not to be amusing myself, through life. And muse means to think, and means not. And a lot of us today can just sort of come home from work and want to watch some, Netflix or watch a movie or watch sports or whatever and not think, right? Mm-hmm. But I believe that right now we have to think more than ever, because if you're not thinking, then you're sleeping or you're being amusing. You're kind of, disconnected. And this is a call for people to be thinkers. And that's why I'm making these kinds of films that are helping people to think about it. And because what I learned is when I had other people see the films that I'm making, they're like, I said to this one man, I said, well, what did it do for you? And he said, it made me bold. He says, I felt confidence. Mm-hmm. And if you are kind of, what an agnostic is, it's a person who has questions. So they go, I can't make a decision one way or the other. I got lots of questions. I think there's a lot of people in Christianity that are sort of closet agnostics. They have so many questions that they don't ever engage in anything. They kind of are just passive. And this isn't a time in the world now to be passive and just sort of be coasting along. Anonymous is another. I thought about making a film called Anonymous. Mm-hmm. Anonymous is, hey, I just want to enjoy my life. I don't want to get involved. I don't want anyone to know, I don't want to ruffle any feathers or anything. But right now we can't be anonymous, I think. And like you said, well, what's this guy from Minnesota going on the other side of the world? Somewhere along the line, it's the call of the hero, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and there are things that I think people are called to. There's a verse in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, I think, for we are Christ's workmanship created. And I have such a terrible time with memory, but we're created to do good works that God has prepared before the creation of time and before the creation of the world. So that is a startling verse to me. My wife showed me that, and I was like, wait a minute. Are you saying that there's works that John Gruder was given before creation, and there's works that Tim Mahoney was given, and your listeners, there are things that they're supposed to be doing. So that's the reason why you have to think, maybe be still, not be amusing yourself through the time period when you're supposed to be doing something really important. And those subtle callings to, hey, come over here, follow me, come down this path, are really, really important to listen to, because life is so short. You want to make sure that what you're doing, and some of the things that I have done, I had no idea that I would
Right.
ever be involved
Right.
with, and I'm sure you are in the same place. But it's one step at a time, right?
Right.
And so you just have to start that the step of that journey.
You know, we're with Tim Mahoney on the No Shame podcast, and we're talking about Patterns of Evidence Moses, a new film that's recently hit theaters. It's going to be, it is available on DVD and other forms of digital media. And you've just crossed over into, you know, Rick Warren wrote the bestseller, The Purpose-Driven Life, that it's not just a slogan or a phrase to sell books, that there is, in fact, a reason you were born. That the Creator who made you and knew you before you were born has a purpose for your life. So if you're anonymous, if you're agnostic, if you're ignoring of that, you might think it's an easier path, but it's kind of a pointless path. If you have been created for a purpose, you're a man or a woman with a purpose. Now here's the only thing I want to say is, doesn't necessarily mean it's all going to go downhill. The path isn't always walking through the fields of, you know, grain. When you do a project like this, when you speak even on a podcast like this, I am sure there's going to be some opposition and some pushback, and some of it from within the church. Have you had to deal with some of that?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Because there's lots of different, well, how many denominations are there?
Yeah.
There's a denominationalism that happens. But I've decided that I'm going to let the Bible sort of speak for itself and try to come and reason together. I also think we have to have a way to have a dialogue. Dialogue is so important. And I feel like there's a generosity. I would share with people, be generous. Be generous in your heart, be generous in your spirit, and listen to what other people are saying. And I'm trying to do that just to help me understand. I have a really good friend. He's an Egyptologist.
Mm-hmm.
He's in our film, David Roll, and he's an agnostic. Now, David has come and lived with me at times when we're filming. One year he lived for 11 weeks, he and his wife. My wife cooked and did his clothes and everything, and he came to our church. He loved going to church. And what we found is that if you're going to speak and be into people's hearts and lives, you have to be able to be in relationship with them. So I think that if you look back at some of the great, in the past, the history of C.S. Lewis and others, they had friends, and those friends were very, very different. And they talked and they communicated. And at the end of the day, it's not the arguments that are going to bring someone to maybe deciding to follow Christ. It's going to be, you know, the greatest of these is love. So that's the thing that endures. And I think that, do I think the arguments are important? Yeah. We have a verse in our booth right now. It's the verse from Isaiah that says, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight His paths." And you know, there's valleys and there's mountains there. Well, I think those valleys and mountains are like doubts. Those are challenges with maybe a part of the Bible or science and archaeology or whatever that people have. So it's important to remove those. But at the end of the day, I think the way people, they're not pinned to the ground by some kind of physical argument that does that basically twists their arm into believing. But I think that helps to make it open for them, because at the end of the day, you can put all the evidence in front of someone, and it's still an issue of the will. Some people can go, yeah, I see this is all true, but I can't accept it because my heart doesn't want to. And I heard there's actually a Catholic Bishop Barron. I don't know if you know him. He's an amazing media, now involved in media. He lives here in Los Angeles. He says the biggest question that the world faces is, who is Jesus? Because he says at the end of it all, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. So that is the ultimate question, who is Jesus? And ultimately, the films I make are about Bible and archaeology, but I'm working on a narrative investigation through the Bible that eventually, if we're allowed to in the next decade, investigate this huge tapestry of information and how it's interwoven together with the truth of God acting in history.
Well, we're with Tim Mahoney once again from Patterns of Evidence, his new film Moses, and
Moses Controversy.
Moses Controversy. Look it up. Look up Tim Mahoney. Look up Thinking Man.
If you go to patternsofevidence.com, you can
Have no shame.